Hello learners, in this lecture we will see what is bleeding and how it looks, and we'll try to understand that what are the reasons for the bleeding. So to put it in a better way, we can call bleeding is also known as water gain. So by the name itself it's understood that there is something gain in the water, so hence it is called as bleeding, right? Even if you see in a very general way, when I say like whenever there's a cut in my hand, right, we say my hand is bleeding, right? So what actually is coming out? The blood is coming out, right, in general term. So in the same way, in a concrete there is a phenomena called bleeding. So in concrete, if there is something bleeding, that means something related to water, hence it is called as water gain. Now we'll see the image of that. See, yeah, so you can see it here. Once you have placed the concrete, you can see a thin layer of water here, right? See on this picture, you can see a lot of water has come at the top of the concrete. Even here, everywhere the water has come. Even here also you can see the water, right? So here also you can see the water. So this phenomena is called as water, is called as bleeding, which you can put it in a better way as water gain. Yeah. So now coming to the textbook definition of this, and also the causes for this. So the process of rise of water along with the cement particles to the surface of a freshly laid concrete is called as a bleeding. So whenever there is a rise of water, so along with the water, a certain amount of cement particles is also going to come to the surface of a freshly placed concrete. We call that as a bleeding. So bleeding is an undesirable property of a concrete, right? Undesirable in the sense we don't want that property, but somehow it will come with the concrete, right? So how it happens actually? So the first is, it is because more water is present than what is actually than what is actually needed for the cement paste to lubricate the aggregate particles, and the solid constituents of the mix are not able to hold all the mixing water when they settle down. That's the first reason. The second is that thus the water rises up. I mean, along with this, as a result of this, the water will rise up and appears on the surface of the compacted concrete. Sometimes a fine particle such as cement is also carried with the rising water, and we call that as a latence, and we'll see what that latence is all about. So the water trapped by the superimposed concrete results in the porous, weak and non-durable concrete. So what is going to happen? The water which has come at the top, after some time it's going to get, after some time the concrete is going to get set, and the water will try to evaporate. As a result of that, a small layer is formed, right? That layer, what we call, is called as latence. So if the rising water is trapped on the underside of the reinforcement, then a zone of poor bond is created. This water forms a voids on the operation and makes the concrete weaker. Obviously, because if that water rises up and if it gets trapped in between the reinforcement, so after some time water will get evaporated. As a result of that, what will happen? That much amount of void will be created. And if the void is created, then what is going to happen? The density of a concrete is going to come down. And if the density of the concrete is going to come down, then obviously there is a, I mean, the strength of the concrete will come down. As a result of that, the concrete will become weaker, right? So this is all about the bleeding, and this is how it happens. So coming to the causes of bleeding, what are the causes for the bleeding? We'll try to see that. Yeah. So first is when excess water is present in the concrete, obviously there will be a bleeding in the concrete. The second is that when fine aggregate are deficient in the concrete mix. What do you mean by this? See, if the fine aggregates, that is a sand and all, if it is very less in quantity, then what will happen? The bleeding is going to happen. That means water will come at the surface. Why is that so? Because if there is a fine aggregate, we have seen that sand, fine aggregate is a sand, what it will do, it will absorb the water, right? Let us say if you're putting more water, sand has that capability, sand has that ability to absorb the water. But if the sand itself is less, then there is no one to absorb the water. As a result of that, since water is lighter when compared to coarse aggregate and fine aggregate, the water will float, and that floating water, what we saw there, is called as bleeding. So whenever there is a deficient quantity of fine aggregate, that is also another reason for the bleeding. The third is that when over compaction of the concrete surface is done, when you try to use vibrator for a very long time, and when you do more and more compaction, so what will happen? The water will try to come at the top, which will result in bleeding. Yeah. Now how to prevent that bleeding? First is, obviously, since when excess water is present in there, so bleeding is going to happen. So the first way to prevent is that by controlling the water content. As far as possible, try to keep the water content minimum, so that that excess amount of water will not go to the top. The second is by using finely ground cement, again for a very same reason. If the cement is also fine, then it has a capacity to absorb the water, right? So that is a reason they have written it here, by using finely ground cement. Next is by controlling compaction, proper mix design. Same thing, because here the causes was due to compaction, over compaction, and if you try to control that compaction, obviously your bleeding will come down. And also by proper mix design, that is if you're taking any mixing any proper, make proper mix design, like putting good amount of cement, good amount of fine aggregate, good amount of coarse aggregate, that entire mixture should be good. So that is how we can prevent the bleeding. And fourth is by adding of pozzolana or the aluminum powder. So by using pozzolana, what will happen, since my pozzolana are very fine in nature, we already seen that this pozzolana like fly ash, GGBS, they're very fine in nature, even finer than the cement. So since they're finer in the cement, obviously what will happen, they'll try to absorb the water. So whatever excess water is there, that will be absorbed by the pozzolana, right? So this is how you can try to control the bleeding. Yeah. So as I mentioned, the one, see, bleeding is going to happen. As a result of bleeding, what is going to happen, a small latency is formed at the top of that. That means along with the water, a kind of a cement paste is going to come at the top of your surface. So that is called as latency. Okay, so it's written here, concrete latency is a layer of a weak and non-durable cement and a fine particles which is originated from the aggregate. These materials are moved upward due to the movement of the moisture, that is called as bleeding, through concrete because of the presence of too much of mixing water. So this is how it looks. You can see it here, right? See, this is called as lightness of concrete. So let me do it in this. Yeah, see, now what has happened, this is the excess water we have at the top. So after some time, what is going to happen, the, due to the atmosphere, right? So water will get evaporated. So once the water gets evaporated, this is how it looks, right? You can see it here, no? You can see everywhere there is a kind of patches and all, right? And also along with that, sometimes what will happen, once your water gets evaporated from here, this is a thin layer which is going to form at the top of your surface, which is called as lightens. So this is this is a result of bleeding. So if you stop the bleeding, all these things will not happen. But once if the bleeding happens, then this is a result of the bleeding. It's like segregation should not happen, right? If segregation happens, then what is going to happen, honeycombing is going to happen out of it, right? It's the same thing here, bleeding should not happen. If there is a bleeding, this is a result of the bleeding. Yeah. Now how you can reduce this, again with very same thing. First is too much mixing water. If you're mixing water too much, then this is the reason for that. Overworking or over manipulating the concrete surface, that is by over compaction. Improper finishing, like when you do the finishing of this properly, or to do the finishing, if you don't do the proper finishing, the chances the water may come at the top, right? Next is poor curing. Even if you don't do the curing after this, then these are the reason for the bleeding to happen, right? Yeah. So I hope this basic understanding about the bleeding is understood. So in the next lecture, we'll try to see how the concrete is manufactured and what are the different ways of manufacturing the concrete. So we'll see you back in the next lecture. Thank you.